What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to the JW Football Show. Last episode, we did a full first-round mock draft. Unfortunately, that discludes 5 NFL teams. So, today, we are going to do a 4-round mock draft for all of the teams that don't have a first-round pick. Let's get right into it. So, I got the PFF mock draft simulator pulled up here, and as you can see, there are 5 teams that don't have a pick in the top 32. Obviously, that'll be the Indianapolis Colts, the Atlanta Falcons, the Green Bay Packers, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Denver Broncos. So, today, we're just going to kind of go through each team one by one and kind of talk about what are some of their possibilities in the draft. I think this is important to do because a lot of people never really talk about these teams. There's a lot of first-round mock drafts coming out, but you don't see a lot of like second and third-round mock drafts. So I want to make sure we talk about some of the teams, for the fan bases that feel a bit neglected. So let's jump in right away with the Indianapolis Colts. So their first pick will come over in the second round, pick 47, and they'll have 3 picks in the first 4 rounds, 2 of which are top 100 picks. If we look at their depth chart, there's a couple of areas that I think I'd want to focus on. Number 1 being linebacker. They did sign Akeem Davis-Gaither. I think that's fine as like a depth signing, but they really don't have anything outside of that. They did draft Jalen Carlisle a few years back. He just kind of really hasn't panned out up to this point. And then they traded Zaire Franklin over to Green Bay for Kobe Wooden here. So I think inside linebacker is a top priority for me. I still think receiver, obviously they traded away Michael Pittman. They did sign Alec Pierce to a huge deal and brought in Westbrook Akine to kind of play that Pittman role, sort of that possession receiver. I think you could absolutely upgrade. Josh Downs is a really good slot. Alec Pierce is a deep option, but I do think you can upgrade over Westbrook Akine as far as kind of a middle of field guy goes. And then I'd still look at kind of the front 7. I like Latu, and I think Arden Key was a solid signing, but Tui Moluel didn't really get to play too much last year. Adebawore, still kind of waiting for him to break out, so maybe some depth signings there. And then lastly, safety. Obviously, I'm a Wisconsin fan, and Hunter Wohler was a great player for Wisconsin and a 7th-round pick for the Colts last year. I'm not sure if they're willing to kind of roll into the season with him as like their slated starter at strong safety. So I think safety is another position we'll look at. So looking at the board here, we wanted to talk about linebacker. Jake Golday, I think, is a great option out of Cincinnati. Safety, AJ Halsey still on the board. He can make a lot of sense as a strong safety. He's kind of a big, kind of lay the boom type player. And then we kind of talked about some receiver options, and I think there's some good ones there too. I do think just, kind of combining player value and need, I might go Jake Golday. I think Jake Golday is really, really good. I would have him much higher than 59 on my personal big board. I think he's good enough to even be maybe an end of round 1 type of pick. If you look, really high run defense and coverage grades. He's 6'4", 240 pounds. He played kind of a weird role at Cincinnati. They kind of asked him to be sort of a nickel defender at times, which, as you can see, 258 snaps in the slot, which is really strange for a player of that size and physicality. But I think, as far as being a kind of do-it-all linebacker for the Colts, I think he not only fits a need, but is a really, really good player. So I think we will go with Jake Golday to start. Next, they pick at 78 in the 3rd round. I think there's a bunch of different ways we could go here. Again, looking at receiver, I don't hate a lot of these guys. I think Ted Hurst is kind of an intriguing option, out of Georgia State, kind of that mid-major school. Malachi Field's a big body. And then Stribling's been getting a lot of hype. He tested really well at the combine. I think all of those guys could be decent options. I'm not sure if we'll look that way here in the 3rd. We also talked about safety. Kamari Ramsey's a guy I've kind of soured on a little bit the more I've watched him. I don't know if he necessarily plays with the physicality necessary to be a consistent starting safety. And then we talked about in a video before that, he was really just a slot defender this year. So we'll kind of see, how does his career pan out. I think Zakee Wheatley would make a lot of sense to play strong safety or free safety, really. He's a big dude, 6'2", 202, that I think has the athletic capability to play both. And then you can kind of put Cam Bynum at that free safety position. So we could look at that as well. And then some of those depth defensive line positions we can look here. I mean, I think Darrell Jackson Jr. could make some sense. Obviously, he wouldn't start right away with Grover Stewart and DeForest Buckner in the middle. But, maybe moving forward, he's your starter. Man, after looking at these options, I feel like there's some reaches we can make here. I don't know if we look at another linebacker. I think corner's looking pretty good after you invested all of that, all of those resources into Sauce Gardner. I'm not sure, you're turning around and drafting one this high right away. Man, I think I'm gonna go with, I'm kind of down to Malachi Fields or Zakee Wheatley. Obviously, both these guys are a little bit of a ways down the PFF board. I really like these guys. I think as third-round picks, I think that's completely valid. I think just based on need, which obviously you don't always want to draft for need, but when we're coming down to, splitting hairs between a guy like Zakee Wheatley and a guy like Malachi Fields is a big body, not necessarily the, craziest athlete in the world, but, really good, can play with physicality over the middle of the field, can make contested catches. I like that a lot. And then Zakee Wheatley, a guy, as a redshirt senior, has played a lot of college football. I think he could come in right away and be a starting safety for you. And I think he gives you versatility to kind of move him and bind him, kind of fluidly throughout the defensive backfield. So I think I will go with Zakee Wheatley just because I think safety is a bigger need than receiver. And he could be your, day one starter at one of those safety spots, just kind of depending on how they feel about him and Bynum, and how their skill sets match. And now at 113, into the fourth round, now we can look at receiver. Obviously, the guys we were kind of talking about in the third round are gone now. I do still think there's some pretty good options. So receiver we could definitely still look at. I wouldn't, completely take it out of the question that they take two linebackers. They're really, really weak there. Looking here, you'd have Akeem Davis-Gaither and then Jake Golday starting at that other spot. And then after that, you got pretty much nothing. So I wouldn't be like shocked if they took two. I think their O-line's looking pretty good. Obviously, they lost Braden Smith. I think they really, really like Jalen Travis. He was a rookie last year who got some burn. I think he looked pretty good. So I think they're kind of just cool sticking with that. I'd love to say they need a new quarterback, but they gave Daniel Jones almost $90 million, so I don't think that's going to happen here, at least not at 113. Maybe they take a developmental guy, near the end of the draft. As far as the receivers go that are left, Brennan Thompson can absolutely fly. He was like the fastest player at the combine. He eclipsed 1,000 yards this year for Mississippi State. I'm not sure if he's the best fit, just because I think he does his best work as a vertical kind of deep threat, and they already have that in Alec Pierce, despite them being vastly different body types. I think C.J. Daniels can make some sense. He's had some injury issues throughout his career. He's played a lot of college football. His production hasn't been great. You can look at kind of his yards here. He had 1,000 yards a few years back, but then, hasn't eclipsed 600 since then. But I think he is a good contesting catch type player. And I think he's a good blocker, which, at the very least gives you a solid floor. So I think we're going to go C.J. Daniels out of Miami. That was kind of a random type flip there. But I think, right away, he's at the very worst, a serviceable blocker, can play physical over the middle of the field. So yeah, we get Jake Golday, Zakee Wheatley, C.J. Daniels. I think Golday and Wheatley right away at least fight for, if not, earn those starting reps right away. And then I think C.J. Daniels, just kind of taking another look at the depth chart, I think, he's kind of competing for that wide receiver 4 role with Doolin and Treadwell. Man, Treadwell's a really cool story. That's kind of a story for another day, but the fact that he's, stuck around the league as long as he has is really cool. But I think C.J. Daniels is kind of right in that conversation with these guys. And then maybe by the end of the season, he takes over for Westbrook Akine. I'm pretty positive Westbrook Akine only got a 1-year deal, so maybe he's your long-term answer there at kind of that wide receiver 3 role. So next up, we have the Atlanta Falcons. Obviously, they lose their first-round pick from that kind of blockbuster trade with the Rams last year when they came back up into the first round to draft James Pierce. Obviously, there's a lot going on with James Pierce. It's kind of hard to address now. I haven't seen a lot of updates as far as like what is his legal situation. But to say the very least, maybe not a guy you can count on at least this coming year. So that's kind of an unfortunate trade, but nonetheless, they got to make picks and they got to make the team better. They bring in Kevin Stefanski to, kind of not necessarily rebuild, but kind of, steer the ship a little bit differently than Raheem Morris was. So we'll see how that goes. Like I said, they don't pick until pick 48 in the second round. And they only have 5 picks total. They all have 3 picks in this mock today. I don't think they have that many like glaring needs. If we take a look over at the Hour Lads at their depth chart here, they did make some at least solid depth signings at receiver. I think that was a really big need. What do you have outside of Drake London? I like Jahan Dotson and Olamide Zaccheaus. Olamide Zaccheaus, a guy who was a key contributor for the Bears this year. He's probably most comfortable in like that wide receiver 4 type 3 role. Same with Jahan Dotson, kind of like a good wide receiver 3. He's sort of been that for Philly over the past few years. So I still think, a true number 2, key wide receiver 2 type player would be a really good pickup. And looking at the defense, this is where I think we'll do most of our work. And that's what I noticed looking at, doing some exercises for these 5 teams prior to recording. A lot of these teams have very similar needs, especially along the defense. A lot of these teams just, their offenses look pretty good, but they need some depth on defense. And I think that matches up with the depth of this class. So lucky for them, I think they'll still be able to make some pretty key contributions to their team despite not having first round picks. A couple of the places I'd look here is obviously number 1. We don't know about James Pierce Jr. Will he be on the team next year? Will he start the season next year? Hard to say, so we'll kind of have to wait and see on that. I do like the Samson Ebukam signing and Azeez Ojulari signings, 2 guys that I think are really good rotational pass rushers. So I don't think you're like hard pressed to take another guy right away because I think Jalen Walker, showed a lot of promise in year 1 and hopefully takes that step in year 2. But I do still think edge pass rusher is a place you'd want to consider. The other one is nose tackle. Ruke Rohoro, who was a second round pick a couple of years ago, is just not a nose tackle. Like I'm pretty sure he was sub 300 pounds, at the combine, during his draft process. And, sure, he could have put on some weight and some muscle, but he just doesn't have a nose tackle body or a nose tackle skill set. So I think to bring in a guy who can really 2-gap, stuff the interior in the run game, and then allow Ruke Rohoro to kind of play that 3-4 defensive end type role, I think that would be really nice. And then corner, I know that the Falcons, maybe I'm wrong, they did just trade CJ Henderson. So that's one, depth piece that's not there anymore. I don't think the Falcons hate Mike Hughes, but I think you can absolutely upgrade. I like Billy Bowman. He obviously, I think it was his Achilles last year that he tore, so they bring Darnay Holmes to kind of play that, sub-nickel type role, depending on how long Billy Bowman's going to be gone. But he's really just, these 2 guys I really just only want to see in the nickel. So I think like an outside cornerback too would make a lot of sense too. So with that being said, we got to kind of look at the value here. One guy I saw right away is Keith Abney, a guy I really, really like. He's not necessarily, doesn't really jump off the screen at you as far as like physical traits or athletic ability goes, but he's been a really, really good player and has only really gotten better over his, career at Arizona State. As you can see here, even looking at some of these more raw numbers, goes from giving up 4 touchdowns to 0, still has 2 interceptions, and then brings his passer rating down from a 79.7 to a 46.1. So he's a guy that I think, just will be like a good player. I don't know if he'll ever be like a star like CB1, but I think, you have Terrell on one side. So I think bringing Abney to be that second guy can make a lot of sense. As far as receiver goes, I think Chris Bell would make a lot of sense. You're getting him, at pick 48 is kind of an injury discount. Obviously he tears his ACL near the end of the year last year, but he kind of brings a different dynamic than what, Drake London does. He's more of that like, really physical, toolsy, stretch the field type of player, which I don't really think they have, even with the guys they picked up in the offseason. So I think for me, it would come down to Chris Bell and Keith Abney. Jeremy Bernard I really like too. He just, to me, is I don't want to say redundant because he's not, but he has a similar skill set to Drake London, kind of that possession guy, really reliable target. And I think, Stefanski would probably look for a bit more of an explosive option. So I think I will go with Chris Bell. He's not always here when I've done these mock drafts. A lot of times he'll go earlier. So I think getting him there at pick 48 to be, that true wide receiver 2 field stretching type of role. And then that allows guys like Dotson and Zaccheaus to kind of play that slot role, sub in as those wide receiver 3s and 4s. Now at pick 79, we still really need a nose tackle. Again, Arohoro, excuse me. Kind of a funny name. Just isn't a nose tackle. I really like a Darrell Jackson Jr. He is giant, 6'5", almost 340 pounds. He had like oven mitts for hands. His hands were just absolutely gigantic. Or catcher's mitts is the better way to put that. Just absolutely giant hands. And even though he didn't play predominantly nose tackle this year, he clearly has, some pretty substantial experience playing, in that A gap type of role. And I wouldn't see any problem with him being that kind of two gapping type interior defensive lineman. And really none of these other guys are interior, like they're all interior defensive linemen, obviously, but they're not really like nose tackle, A gap, two gapping type of players. I think the next one that you'd be really confident in doing that is kind of Tim Keenan. But not here at 79. I think just with some of his injuries, and, kind of athletic concerns, I'm not sure that's where I go. But I do really like Darrell Jackson Jr. here at 79. Excuse me. I know, a couple months ago, I took him to the Bears even in the second round. So I still think he's a really good player, and I think he'd make a big difference for Atlanta here at pick 79. Next, we still have looking at corner. Will Lee's a really good player, so we'll definitely consider him. They could upgrade at linebacker. They lost Ellis, but they still have Divine Diablo. They picked up Christian Harris, who I've always thought is a pretty good player for Houston. Just kind of, not in their top, 2 or 3 inside linebackers, but I think for Atlanta, he'll be pretty good. Troy Anderson, another guy who's played pretty well throughout his career, just been hurt all of the time. So I still think you want to look at interior or middle linebacker. But looking at corner, there's some guys I really like. I think Will Lee, really just a predominantly man coverage corner so far. During his career at Texas A&M, I don't see any problem with that in Atlanta. They blitz a lot, so kind of leave some of those one-on-one matchups on the back end. Jalen Kilgore to me isn't a corner; he's more of a safety type of prospect. Takario Davis is a really nice player too. A few years ago, he was looked at as like a consensus first-round pick until he had a rough year last year, or 2 years ago, I should say, in 2024 for Arizona. Transfers over to Washington and only plays those 7 games, so clearly some injury concerns there. But he's he's listed at 6'4", and I think he was over 200 pounds at the combine. So definitely checks all the physical boxes you'd want. It's just a matter of can you put it all together. I think because Atlanta's looking for like a true CB2, I think I will go with Will Lee. I'm just more confident in Will Lee, especially early in his career, than I am with Takario Davis. Moving forward, maybe Takario Davis is a better player, but I think right now, Will Lee's going to be a better contributor, and I think, with Stefanski coming in, he's not looking to rebuild. He's done that for the past, God knows how long with Cleveland, so I think he's ready to start winning now. So I think Will Lee gives you the best chance to do that. The PFF mock draft simulator really likes this draft. We got some really good value here. Overall draft grade of an A. I really like this for Atlanta. You get that true wide receiver 2 next to Drake London. You get an actual nose tackle, or what you would hope to be a nose tackle, in Darrell Jackson Jr., and then Rook Rohoro can kind of move around at the defensive line. And then Will Lee, who maybe doesn't take over from Mike Hughes day one, but I think absolutely could, as time goes on. So that's Atlanta. Let's move on to our next team. All right, next up we have the Green Bay Packers, everybody's, or at least most people in my comments, favorite team. The Packers obviously don't have their first-round pick after trading for Micah Parsons last year. I think Packers fans, I would hope, are pretty satisfied with that decision. You get rid of some first-round picks, but you get, a top 3 pass rusher in the game. Obviously he got hurt at the end of last year, but I still think Packers fans at least should be happy with that deal. The Packers do still have some needs, especially after, a pretty quiet offseason. Looking at their depth chart here, obviously they lose Romeo Doubs. Excuse me. I think they're okay with that just after, kind of filling their receiver room over the past few years. I think they have enough guys to kind of take on his role. They bring in Javon Hargrave late in the free agency process after he's cut from Minnesota. I really like that. I think he's at the very worst a good interior pass rusher for them. I'm not quite sure he fixes their run defense concerns, especially in the kind of middle of their defense. So I think, a run-stuffing defensive lineman is a guy we consider. I like linebacker now after trading for Zaire Franklin. I think the combination of him and Edgerrin Cooper is just fine. I still think, and it's been the case since kind of the downfall of Jair Alexander, the Packers really need a CB1. I don't think that guy's on the roster right now. I actually do like the Benjamin St-Juste signing. It was a pretty cheap deal. He's a big outside corner. I mean, he's not a CB1, but at the very worst, he's, a rotational type of guy. But you still, like, right now you have Keyshawn Nixon and Carrington Valentine, slated to start on the outside. To me, it's just really hard to win Super Bowls like that, and I think that's where this team's at, right? Like, they're one of the couple teams, on this video that, their aspirations are Super Bowl, and it's really hard to do that when you're relying on Keyshawn Nixon and Carrington Valentine and Benjamin St-Juste in pass coverage every game. So I think, a true corner is a guy we'd want to look at. I don't know who that's going to be, especially in the second round. That's one of those positions that it can be kind of hard to find outside of the first round, but we'll do our best. And then obviously they traded Rashawn Gary. I kind of want to tip my cap on that one. I kind of, guessed that he was going to get traded. I had him going to the Raiders in that Packers rebuild episode, but he did end up getting traded for very similar value that I kind of thought he was going to get. I don't mind that trade for Green Bay, but that does mean that, outside of Micah Parsons, who might not even be healthy to start the year, you're relying on Baron Sorrell and Lucas Van Ness, who, obviously I think Sorrell has some promise to him, right? But are you trusting him to be your number one pass rusher or even number two pass rusher this year? I'm not quite sure. And then again, I almost skipped over this. Their interior offensive line, Aaron Banks just, hasn't been a good signing for them, at least, 1 year into his contract. I think Packers fans are pretty disappointed with what he's given them so far. And then Anthony Belton's at least an okay player, but I'm not sure if he's like your long-term answer at guard. He was a second-round pick, so they invested some pretty decent capital into him. But I still think interior offensive line is a place we could consider. Looking at the board here, the problem what I'm seeing is, Keontae Scott is a nickel defender, right? He's going to play. Maybe he switches to like strong safety, but he's not going to play true outside corner. Same thing with Trayton Stukes, who I love, right? He's had a really cool story. He was a walk-on. Now he's a team captain. Again, he's going to be a nickel defender or a safety. Davison Igbinosun is the guy I think for the Packers specifically. I know he's a little bit down the board here at pick 68, but I think he'd make a lot of sense for Green Bay because he's a big corner. He has long arms, and he's predominantly a man coverage corner, which is what the Packers have done. At least, obviously, we'll kind of have to see what they do this year. They bring in Gannon to be their defensive coordinator, but I would be surprised if they get too far away from that. He's really physical in man coverage, sometimes to his own demise. He's had a lot of penalties over the past, couple of years for Ohio State, but he's been, a CB2 or CB1 for, one of the best defenses in the country over the past few years. So I really like Davison Igbinosun. I think the Packers specifically would be a big fan of him too. I know we talked about edge pass rusher as well. I think Malachi Lawrence would make a lot of sense, despite, he doesn't have necessarily that size that the Packers always look for. It seems like they kind of like those bigger, heavier set type defensive ends or not defensive ends, at outside linebacker, guys that can stop the run a little bit better. So maybe they consider Malachi Lawrence. Maybe a guy like Dennis Sutton would be more their speed. He has some, like it says here, he has some flexibility to play that 3-4 outside linebacker or 4-3 defensive end. I think as far as his physical traits go, he might make a little bit more sense. So we'll kind of see on that. I think for the Packers, I am going to go Davison Igbinosun. I'm not sure if Packers fans, how much they know about him. I do think he's a pretty good player, right? He forced 10 incompletions last year. He has extensive experience playing outside corner, as you can see, 600 to almost 700 snaps in 2023 and 2024. And then this past year plays, 550 about. So I think, he's had a lot of experience playing outside corner. He has the man coverage, instincts and physicality that you'd hope for. It just can't kind of clean up some of those penalties. So he might, frustrate you, give you some headaches maybe year one, but I don't think it's stuff that you can't coach out of him as far as, being a little bit later with his hands, being a little bit less grabby. So yeah, I think if he can clean that up, he has the potential to be a CB1. It's just, kind of an if with him. But I think in the second round, that's about as good as you could hope for with a second round corner. Those guys aren't going to be, home run CB1s, day one of their careers. So I think Igbinosun has good potential, especially in the Packers scheme, to do that. Wow, Dennis Sutton went off the board. Was that recent that he went off the board? Where did he go off? That was the guy I was kind of considering here. He went off. Where did he go off? I don't see him. I was really hoping to pick up denied Dennis Sutton here as kind of that versatile defensive line piece. Maybe I'm blind. Well, not maybe. I'm absolutely blind. But he's not here. That's fine. We'll kind of pivot. We talked about a run-stopping defensive lineman. Rayshon Benny is a pretty good player. He's not doesn't have that typical interior defensive line run stopping size, right? It's not like he's this 330-pound mauler, but he still has, pretty solid size. He's not like he's undersized for the position. He's had a really high run defense grade this year. A 7.5% run stop rate. That's okay, right? Nothing to write home about, but definitely solid. I don't think he's going to offer you too much as a pass rusher. I don't think he's quite that athlete. But maybe Dante Corleone, the Godfather, it says that here. He was one of the most dominant run defenders in college football throughout his career. He's a guy that just doesn't have necessarily, not the size, but the length. He's 6'1", maybe even shorter. I'm not sure exactly what he measured in at the combine, but he's a kind of a fire hydrant type of build, really stocky, really strong, just a little bit shorter. But he is a really good run defender despite that. I think the Packers oftentimes are billed as like, they have these, and not even billed, I think rightfully so, they have these very seemingly strict physical thresholds for their players. They want guys to have a certain arm length, to be a certain size, to hit certain measurables. And I think, unfortunately, Dante Corleone doesn't necessarily embody a lot of that, right? He doesn't have long arms. He's not an insane athlete. But I really do think that he would make an impact for Green Bay day one, right, as a run defender. Again, he's not going to be, a crazy pass rushing presence from the inside, but that's what you have Devontae Wyatt for, right? So despite him not being that physical type of presence they might want, I think that can make sense. Xavier Harris is a guy who I think they would love from a physical standpoint, right? He's 6'8", 330 pounds. So he fits everything that Green Bay would want, as far as an interior defensive line goes, size-wise. But he's not really a dominant run defender. He's kind of like Deion Walker from last year. He's more of like a inside pocket pushing, disruptive pass rushing run defender, as opposed to like, taking up 2 blocks and dominating the run game. Like, I don't think he could ever really play nose tackle for you. And he's also had some pretty significant off the field concerns. I think he was allegedly accused of drunk driving and then domestic violence, like in a 1 or 2 year span. Obviously very serious stuff you have to figure out. What is the situation looking like before you even consider drafting a guy like this? So despite, his physical capability, maybe not where you'd want to go at pick 84. Chris McClellan, he has that prototypical size. Like, he definitely looks the part as far as interior defensive linemen go. Again, not a guy that you're going to want to play like nose tackle. He just doesn't really have that type of play style. But I think he gives you a little bit higher of a floor as a pass rusher than the other guys do. Again, I'm not sure if he's like a 2-gapping, like take up 2 blocks, just dominate, reset the line of scrimmage. But I do think he has the physical capabilities to at least be like a plus run defender. And I think 125 is really low for him. I think if you can get him during the middle or end of the 3rd round, I think that's pretty good business. So I would consider him too. Man, Green Bay is definitely the team I struggle with the most, not only because I know fans are going to yell at me. Fans and friends are going to yell at me, based on what I do. But also, it's just like their needs just don't line up super well with like where the value of the draft is. I do think ultimately I'm going to go with Chris McClellan because he's kind of the balance between Xavier Harris and Dante Corleone. He has, a higher run defending floor than Xavier Harris, and he has better size than Dante Corleone. I think he would at least check the boxes. So I'm going to go Chris McClellan here. Maybe not your starting guy right away, but can definitely rotate in with Hargrave as the year goes on. And then their last pick here at pick 120, in round 4, I think interior offensive line, at least depth of that position, is still a position, we could consider. Maybe they take another corner. I'd be surprised. They just haven't really invested in the position like that over the past few years. And I think they trust their development with some of the guys just based on, how long some of them have stuck around. So I'm not sure they kind of double dip at that position. Maybe linebacker. I just don't know if that's really, I think they're fine with their depth. I think Franklin and Cooper, like I said, are really good starting options. And then McDuffie and Hopper, I think, are just fine as backups. So, sure, you could draft one, but I think their path to playing time would be pretty brutal. I think that's a pretty good room. Maybe we look back at edge pass rusher. We drafted interior. We got a corner. Mason Reiger. You could keep Mason Reiger in state. He's not like a huge, dominant run defending type of guy, but he's a really, really good athlete. Like one of the best athletes at the position at the combine this year. Had a breakout year this year for Wisconsin after coming over from Louisville. Obviously, I got to watch a lot of Mason Reiger this year. And I think, maybe he's not your starter, but I think rotating him in with guys like Lucas Van Ness, who maybe play on the early downs, and then Mason Reiger comes in for some of those more obvious passing situations and kind of just gets to play with his hair on fire. I actually really like that. And, you combine that with kind of the in-state, like keep him in-state. I know he's not, a through and through Wisconsin guy. Like he didn't grow up in Wisconsin. He hasn't always gone to Wisconsin. But I think, after having his breakout here, I think it'd be really fun to keep him in-state. So I think that's what we're going to do. I was going to say, I don't think the mock draft simulator is going to love these picks just because based on PFF, we did some reaching. I'm not really too concerned with that. If you want to go ahead and watch these guys for yourself, I think a lot of you will come to similar conclusions. But yeah, Igbenogson to be that man coverage corner, maybe a potential CB1, down the line in his career. McClellan as a rotational interior defensive lineman, can do a little bit of everything for you and definitely looks the part. And then Mason Reiger, at the very worst, a passing down defensive lineman that can come in, play with his hair on fire, really get around the edge. I really like the idea of him opposite of Micah Parsons on passing downs. So that's going to do it. Again, like I said, the overall draft grade C- from PFF. I disagree. I think the value for all these guys is just about where you'd want. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you think. I know you guys will. And we're going to move on to the next team. All right, second to last team here. We're on to the Jacksonville Jaguars, who pick at pick 56. They don't have their first round pick because they traded it to the Cleveland Browns last year when they moved up for Travis Hunter. I think the Jaguars overall have one of the more complete rosters in the NFL. I think Liam Cohen's done a really nice job kind of building the team he wants and the way he envisions it. And I think that came to fruition this year, right? They made it to the playoffs. I know they lost to Buffalo, but I think they're definitely, in line to compete in that division with Houston, and even Indy's kind of in there, right? So, also the Jags definitely have the most picks of any of these teams, at least in the range we're looking at. They have 5 picks in the top 124, 4 of which are top 100 picks, which is really intriguing for a team that already has a very good roster. If we take a quick peek at their depth chart, you're not going to see a whole lot of very glaring needs. They really didn't do anything in free agency. They brought in Chris Rodriguez, which I actually really like, to be in that running back room after but just, opting not to re-sign Travis Etienne. A couple places I would look. Number one being interior. I keep saying interior linebacker. I don't know where that's coming from. Being middle linebacker. Obviously they lost Devin Lloyd to Carolina this year. He opts to walk and go to play for the Panthers. I still like Foyesade Oluokun, but I'm not sure how confident you are in Ventrell Miller being your linebacker 2. I think the rest of the defense is honestly pretty good. I think you could definitely use a third pass rusher. Trayvon Walker just got a really good contract. I love that for Trayvon Walker. He's had a rough go of it, not necessarily because he's playing bad, but because they took him over Aiden Hutchinson. And, despite Trayvon Walker being a very, very good NFL player, he kind of always gets put down because Aiden Hutchinson's been better. So really well-deserved contract for Trayvon Walker. I'm glad he got that deal done. But the idea of having, Josh Hines-Allen on one of the outside rusher spots, and then on passing downs, you can kick Trayvon Walker inside. And if you could get another pass rusher outside of that, I think all of a sudden you're really cooking and can, like drop of a dime, have one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. So I think pass rusher, linebacker, 2 spots I really like. Maybe not in the second round, but Brenton Strange had a breakout year last year. He's a really good, and reliable option for this passing game. But I think getting like a really, consistent wide tight end inline type of player behind him, I think could make a lot of sense, especially for this run game that Liam Cohen loves. So we'll kind of look into that. And then interior offensive line, they were, definitely serviceable last year, but, there's for sure room to upgrade. You got Ezra Cleveland and Patrick McCarry at your guard spots. I think both of those guys are upgradable. They did draft Wyatt Milam last year, who I really, really liked. There was times where I thought he was going to be a first-round pick. Obviously ends up going in the third. I think there's a chance he takes over one of those spots this year. But regardless, you still have another spot to fill. Or I guess not fill, but maybe improve upon. So we'll see. I think interior offensive line makes some sense. So we're looking at interior offensive line, maybe like an inline tight end, a pass rusher. Oh, and the other position I forgot is safety. Again, this is like what I was saying earlier. I think a lot of these teams have very similar needs, especially on defense. Antonio Johnson and Eric Murray, both guys that are fine. Again, kind of similar to the guard conversation. Like, I don't think you're pulling your hair out with these guys at safety, but I think you could definitely upgrade. So after all of that, let's get right into it. Looking at safety, again, I'm not really comfortable taking these guys at 56. Pass rusher is kind of the thing I was most excited about. And honestly, Joshua Josephs could be a really, really good pick. I know he's not like the biggest need for the Jags, but he kind of fits that bill as like that passing down, come in on third and fourth and just wreak havoc. And especially, if you have Trayvon Walker kind of kicking inside and you have Hines Allen on the outside, having Josephs to come in on passing downs, I think that would be really, really nice. And then maybe interior offensive line. I really like Keelan Rutledge, but man, I think after looking at it, I think I am just going to go with Joshua Josephs, excuse me. I really like that pick. He's kind of fit that mold of like the Tennessee guys that, if you think about to like Omar Norman Lott, who ended up going to Kansas City last year, like they, for some reason, don't really give their guys a lot of snaps. Like, as you can see, he played, significantly less than 400 snaps this year, which is really, really low for a guy who like profiles as like, not prototypical size, maybe a little bit undersized, but, has all the ability in the world. And for some reason, Tennessee just doesn't really deploy their guys like that. So we'll kind of see what he can do in maybe a more expansive role, but he's used to being a rotational guy, and that's what he'd be with Jacksonville. So I really like that for them. Now at pick 81, they have a couple picks here, pretty quick succession. So number one, I think we can go back and look at safety. Now is where I'd be a little bit more comfortable with a guy like Genesis Smith, who has some really, really special ability in coverage, like has a lot of range, a lot of length in the back end. He just really isn't a tackler. He's not really, like, he'll never be a consistent run defender, which is fine if you're picking him in the third round. I think if he can play on the back end and just be that free roaming type of player, I think that can make some sense for them. Another position we wanted to talk about was linebacker. Man, I am going to go with Anthony Hill here. I'm of the opinion that Anthony Hill just isn't going to be here. I think you can say what you want about maybe some of his play strength, or I guess attitude while he plays. Like, he's not, the most violent run defender, despite being, prototypically sized for an inside linebacker. But he's a big guy who tested really, really well at the combine, who's been, a starting middle linebacker for an SEC team. Like, you guys can stop me if I'm lying, but these are the type of dudes that go high in the NFL draft. Teams love these type of dudes. So I would be actually kind of surprised if he was there down at 81. But in this mock draft, he is, right? And the crazy thing is that PFF is still going to call this a reach. But again, he's 6'3", 6'4", about 240 pounds. He tested really, really well this year. I don't think that the NFL is going to look at him as low as some analysts do. So for me, I think that's just fine at pick 88. And then I think I'm going to circle back. I know we talked about this briefly, and take Genesis Smith to play that free safety role. I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we're all defense so far, which I think that's fine, right? I think despite Jacksonville having a pretty good defense last year, they somehow retained their defensive coordinator, who got a lot of looks to be a head coach. I think he'll probably be gone after this year. Usually that means that very soon he will be a head coach. But I think they keep a strength to strength, keep building on what you have. Now at pick 100, with their third pick in the third round, Billy Schrauth, to be fully transparent, while I was doing this, some of the prep for this and kind of doing some mock drafts on my own, seeing, what are these teams kind of looking at here, Billy Schrauth is a guy that I really like for Jacksonville for a couple of reasons. Number one, he has he's a good zone blocker. I think Liam Cohen really likes getting his running backs out into space, get going in the screen game. I think he has the athletic capability to do that consistently. Obviously prototypical size, 6'4", 310. True pass set pass blocking grade, also very high. Didn't give up a sack this year for Notre Dame, who was obviously very good. The one problem, this is a guy that goes top 50 if he's fully healthy. The problem is he's not, right? Look at the past few years, 10, 12, 7 games. A lot of these games that he played, he's been beat up in. So I think there's definitely some kind of, durability concerns. But again, for a guy that probably would have gone top 50 if it weren't for some, reliability and health concerns, I think, pick 100 to be at the very worst a rotational left guard for them. Like I said, Ezra Cleveland and Patrick McCarry were fine last year. So I think Billy Schrauth is definitely more talented than those guys. But maybe give him a year, get his body right, learn the system, and then maybe moving forward, he's like your franchise left guard. I think he's that type of player. So I really like that at pick 100. And then their last pick 124. I know we talked about tight end, And there's actually a couple of guys I like here for that. We talked about how Brenton Strange was more of that, vertical threat, get down the seam. I'd like if they could get a guy that could play more consistently on the line of scrimmage. And to me, the best option for that is Marlon Klein. He's a guy that you can see here in his bio. From Germany, he hasn't played football all that long, but he's 6'6", 250 pounds and played, at one of the better programs in the country as far as physical development goes. And it even says here, he's a very difference-making or a potentially difference-making inline tight end. And, if he can just be, at least earlier in his career, a consistent blocking, tight end too, I think that's exactly what Jacksonville needs. And I think that even brings, kind of an extra element to Liam Cohen's run game. If they can run, 12 personnel with Brenton Strange and Marlon Klein on the field, and then, if Marlon Klein can develop into, a more consistent, pass threat, all of a sudden you're really dangerous on offense. But I think day one, at the very least, you get some heavier bodies in there. You can run those outside zones. And Brenton Strange at least still gives you that passing, pass catching upside. So I think I will go with Marlon Klein here. Honestly, the Jags have been the most fun team to draft for. Not only because they have 5 picks, but because I think the board, typically lines up very well with some of their needs. For me, if I was a Jacksonville fan, I would be super excited about the 2026-2027 year, especially if you get a draft like this. Potential starting safety, a probable starting inside linebacker, at the very worst, a plus upside rotational pass rusher, a rotational interior offensive lineman, and a tight end too. I think that not only addresses a lot of their needs, but gives them some athletic capability, especially with these first 3 guys that they just didn't have before. Again, if there's any Jacksonville fans, and I don't really know any Jacksonville fans, but if somebody's a big Jaguars guy or girl, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. For me, I'm gonna be super excited about this. So let's get into our last team. All right, last but certainly not least is the Denver Broncos. Obviously we're probably a Bo Nix away from making the Super Bowl last year. They just recently lost their first round pick because they traded for Jalen Waddle. Honestly, that's one of the better trades, in recent NFL memory for me. I think for both sides. Jeff Hafley talked about it. Miami gets younger. They get to add 2 rookie contracts to a rebuilding team. And Denver, who, has been kind of looking for that wide receiver too. I think, obviously Jerry Jeudy wasn't that when he was a part of the Broncos. And now I think they like Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin as maybe wide receiver 3s. Pat Bryant, kind of the same thing, more of that physical outside type, blocking wide receiver 3 or 4. But Waddle just brings them something they've just never had, especially while Courtland Sutton's been there. So I really like that 1-2 punch for them. This, is definitely one of the more complete rosters in the NFL. Not a whole lot of glaring needs here, if any. I think if anything, maybe this is what I was talking about earlier, maybe inside linebacker. They were able to bring back Justin Strnad and Alex Singleton. Drew Sanders just hasn't really come along the way they'd hoped. Jonah Ellis can kind of play both. He's been kind of an inside-outside type of guy throughout his career for Denver. Dre Greenlaw, that experiment didn't work out either. So I guess looking for a long-term answer at inside linebacker, that would be one place to look. They did lose John Franklin Myers during free agency, who played that 3-4 defensive end role. He was a really, really good pass rusher for them. So I think if you're not going to be able to replace a guy that talented with a rookie right away, I don't think that's really hard to do, especially without a first round pick. But bringing in a guy that could play some of that role, I think that can make a lot of sense. And then the offense to me is mostly good. They've re-signed pretty much their entire offensive line. Quinn Miners is an all-pro. Shout out, UW Whitewater. They re-signed Alex Palshevsky. Luke Wattenberg got an extension. So I think they're pretty good along the offensive line. And then obviously their tackles are making a lot of money. Eventually they'll have to think about what does life look like out after Garrett Bowles. But they're not in that spot yet, so I don't think that's like a big pressing need. Maybe you like an outside corner to compete with Riley Moss. Obviously, Pat Surtain's probably the best corner in the NFL. Jaquan McMillan's a really good nickel. You drafted Jahdae Barron last year to kind of play that nickel role, so we'll see what he does. Riley Moss just gets picked on a lot naturally. The milk checks just because he's opposite of Pat Surtain. He'll be playing the last year of his deal this year, so maybe you consider bringing in some competition for him moving forward. But yeah, again, this team doesn't really have any crazy needs. Like I said, linebacker is something we could consider. I actually really like Josiah Trotter in this spot. He is a like kind of old school downhill, like take your head off type of inside linebacker. Unfortunately, that does come with some lacking skills in coverage. You know, obviously a really low coverage grade. You can see here, you know, he allowed 84, almost an 85% completion percentage. You know, 28 for 33, touchdown allowed, no picks, 108 passer rating. He struggled in coverage, but he has all the athletic capability in the world to be a good, you know, pass coverage player. He just hasn't quite developed that part of his game. And he's declaring as a true, or I almost said true junior. I guess he's a redshirt sophomore even. You know, he'll be 21 years old during his rookie year. So I really like the idea of bringing in Josiah Trotter to, you know, day one at least be a really good run stopping linebacker. But then, you know, if he gets to sit behind Justin Stroh and Alex Singleton for a little while, he can kind of develop those pass coverage skills and become a more complete player. And maybe moving forward, he's your LB1. So I really like that for Denver. I think that gives him a really good opportunity to kind of grow as a player. You know, he's not forced right away to be like a team's LB1, which I think, you know, in the long term might be kind of bad for him. If we look at defensive line, Caleb Proctor actually isn't too far off what you would hope. You know, he could do kind of that John Franklin Myers role, kind of a similar size, 6'3", 280 pounds. I'm pretty sure that's right around where John Franklin Myers is. Obviously, you know, playing for Southeastern Louisiana, the level of competition there isn't quite, to say the least, it's not quite what he's going to see in the NFL. But he had 9 sacks last year. He's been over 90 pass rush grade, and an almost 14% pass rush win rate from the interior is really, really good. I really like, you know, Caleb Proctor as a potential John Franklin Myers replacement. Again, is he going to be the run defender Franklin Myers was right away, and even the pass rusher? Probably not, right? But I think he at least gives you that upside. And then Xavier Harris, very similarly, you know, hasn't been nearly as productive as Caleb Proctor, and, you know, has a completely different level of size than Caleb Proctor. So maybe they consider him too. Again, to me, I just wouldn't be comfortable taking a guy like that in the top, you know, 4 or 5 rounds, just off of some very significant off the field concerns. If those things get cleared up, then so be it, right? Maybe he's a 2nd round pick. But I still think there's some questions that need to be answered with him before I'm comfortable investing a lot in him if I were an NFL team. So I think I will go with Caleb Proctor here, a guy that a lot of people probably haven't heard of. He's kind of flown under the radar just, you know, based off playing at a smaller school. But I think the Broncos, again, they're not really looking for, you know, day one stars, right? They have a very, very good roster. Again, I think he'd be a really good spot. You know, maybe he's playing behind Owuzurike and Savion Jones right away. You know, he can learn from Zach Allen. But he brings that pass rushing upside that I think you really miss with losing a guy like Franklin Myers. And then lastly, they just re-signed Adam Troutman. He's kind of like their blocking guy, and then they have Evan Ingram to play some more of that like Joker role that Sean Payton has always had. He was kind of underwhelming for me this past year. I really liked that signing when it happened. I thought he was kind of a perfect fit. He just, you know, his usage wasn't really where I thought it was going to be. And I can't remember what his contract, I kind of want to look that up actually. What was Evan Ingram's contract? Like how long is 2 years? Okay, so he'll be on the last year of his deal here. The last year of his deal in 2026, 2027. So I think, you know, if you're looking long term at that, you know, kind of more, you know, predominantly receiving option, I think Justin Joly would be perfect for that. He fits a lot of what, you know, I think Sean Payton would look for. I forgot I can't click his name here. He, you know, fits a lot of what Sean Payton would look for in a tight end. Here, obviously, it says to talk, you know, maybe Michael Trigg, another guy who has some weird off the field concerns and didn't test very well. I'm kind of not a huge Michael Trigg fan. But Jolly was a really good receiver for the past couple years for NC State. A lot of times he's been kind of their top slot receiving option, which is, I think, kind of what Sean Payton would hope for in his Joker position. So I really like that fit. Again, not looking for a day one, you know, key contributor, but I think all 3 of these guys in the same kind of mold, you know, maybe day one, they get a chance to kind of sit behind more seasoned vets, but in the next, you know, year, 2 years, 3 years, could very well become, you know, key players for an already really, really good team. So yeah, that's going to do it for me. If you're a fan of any of these 5 teams, please, let me know in the comments, what do you think your team should do? Do you agree with what I did for them? What do you kind of see as some of your team's biggest needs? So yeah, that's going to kind of do it for me. I think my next video, I'm going to look at kind of the teams that control the draft, right? What teams have the most picks, or maybe the highest amount of, premium capital, and kind of do mock drafts for them. Obviously the draft's coming up in just a few weeks, so a lot of the content's going to be kind of centered around that. If you have any ideas, again, please feel free to reach out, whether it be in the comments or just to me directly. I'd love to hear what you guys think. But otherwise, it's going to do it for me. I'll see you guys in the next video.